You're listening to Connections Radio, the sound of business. I'm Louisa Wizzi Magnuson with Sanam Anderlini on the business of peace and hope. Sanam Anderlini is one of the very few trained female UN peace negotiators and strategists of Iranian heritage. With 30 years as a peace advocate and negotiator, she is now the CEO and founder of the International Civil Society Action Network, ICAN. Sanam believes that politics should be discussed, but respectfully without demeaning or insulting others for their different ways of thinking. This is the business of peace and hope. Welcome to Connections Radio, Sanam, and thank you for joining me today. Could you please start by taking me through your career background?
Thank you. Lovely to be with you. As my career background is kind of strange. I started life in my 20s with a interest in media and marketing. I did some marketing work, and then I worked for a bank for a little bit, and then I went into news journalism. I worked in the newsroom at CNN and BBC, but I was interested in how you make change. And I just remember in 1994, there was two screens. One was Mandela's inauguration in South Africa, and the other one was the genocide in Rwanda. And I just remember thinking, how can you film a genocide and not do anything about it, which is kind of timely for these days, actually. But it propelled me into wanting to make change. Also, because I'm Iranian by background and I was 11 when the revolution happened, I was always interested in how do you go about having conflict is normal in any society, but how do you go about transforming the conflict non-violently so that you avoid ruptures and wars and violence and kind of losing life as I knew it anyway. So these two things kind of propelled me in the direction of my work around conflict prevention and non-violent conflict transformation is the sort of jargon that we use.
And what does a peace advocate and negotiator actually do?
That's a very good question. My mother keeps saying that in the last 30 years I've been doing this work, the world has gotten worse. So maybe I'm not very good at my job.
Bless you.
But what we do is first of all, we anticipate and see the early warning signs of rumbles and violence. And it's not just, oh, there's lots of poverty, so there's going to be violence. It's really like I have a sort of, when I teach, I sort of use it like a volcano imagery of there are certain indicators that exist in societies, and then things change, politics change, things that in the economy might change, and then you get a trigger. So a classic example is the Tunisian young man who self-immolated in 2011 that sparked the Tunisian revolution and all the sort of chaos that we've now seen in the Middle East. There were lots of underlying factors, but you can see it coming. And then the question is, are you willing to do something about it? And I specifically work with women because what I realized very early on in my career was that on the ground, women are the first ones to feel and see and hear the changes. And there is a small cohort, but an extraordinary cohort of women who run to the problem as opposed to running away from it. And they are the peace builders, and they're the people that I work with and I've supported in my organization through ICAN and the network that we have around the world.
That's fascinating. So why is that, do you think?
Why is it that women step up?
Yeah.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, one of the things that I've seen around the world as conflicts break out, and also from the Iranian experience, so when I sort of took the mirror and I looked back at our own experience in Iran, is that when you have crises fueling and brewing, actually, it becomes really difficult for men, especially young men, to be out in public. I mean, they're the first ones to be recruited into militias or the first ones to be arrested. Armies and militias come looking for men. There's a tendency to think that women are passive, that they're not a threat, that they're not so significant. So if you have a group of women getting together under a tree, for example, in South Sudan, they're just seen as, oh, they're just a bunch of women talking. If you go back to the 1990s or the late 80s, early 90s in Israel and Palestine, when the first intifada happened in Palestine against the occupation, young men would get picked up in the streets. It was the women who could organize and meet and so forth. So there is an element of kind of flipping the stereotypes around women that, oh, women aren't dangerous and women aren't a threat. And that's why women get to come out in front. And then there's also an element of a male police officer, security officer will think twice before beating up a woman if they're protesting. Now, a lot of that has changed. In Iran, we've seen them deliberately going after the women. In Afghanistan, we've seen it. Sadly, right now in the Gaza genocide, we're seeing that women represent a huge percentage of the victims, right? Children are the most, but women are there too. So things are changing, but essentially there is an element of, ironically, safety or safer that women can come forward. That's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of this is that what we see is women see their sons, their fathers, their husbands, their partners at risk, and they step up, or they see their children at risk and they just run to try and resolve it. Or if the men have been killed, the women are forced into the public space. You know, in the Iraq War, 90% of those who were killed originally were men. So even if you want to stay in the traditional sort of home space, you have to step into the public space. So it's a variety of factors that come into the mix.
Okay. Tell me about the International Civil Society Action Network, when you founded it, and what it does.
So I had done, I started this work in the 1990s, and I was working for an organization here in the UK, and I did advocacy, and we said, let's go to the Security Council, and I did research, and, you know, so I was doing a lot of this work in the run up to eventually founding ICAN. And I was invited into the UN to train their staff on what they should be doing in conflict areas in terms of, you know, mediation, negotiations issues, in terms of how you do electoral processes. I was actually invited in to help them think through how to have a gendered lens to their work. And what I discovered was that you can give as many workshops and trainings and work plans to people, or research findings, but it doesn't get implemented, which is a real frustration. Secondly, that basically, again, when you see it's local women on the ground who are stepping up to make the change, there's such a gap between them and the international forces at play. And so my colleagues in war zones, the women that I knew and I had worked with, said to me, can we have an organization where we will be the de facto foot soldiers? We're doing the work on the ground, but we need a connection to the national and international spaces. So in a way, ICAN was kind of a co-creation between them and me, and the alliance that we have is really a genuine partnership that I always say, you know, my colleagues in Pakistan or Yemen are doing things that I would never be able to do because I'm not of that community and of that culture. But I can connect them to the UK government or to the UN system or to the governments and spaces that I have access to. And so kind of being a bridge and a connector is part of it. So that was the impetus. And then, you know, we saw that there wasn't money going down to the ground, and we talked to governments and philanthropists saying, hey, you know, you say you want to support women's peace building organizations. And they would say, oh, well, we don't know who they are. And so I said, okay, well, we know who they are. And so we set up the first it's the first and only independent fund that we have that gives money directly to women-led peace building organizations in conflict areas. So it kind of was, it's been like filling gaps where they existed and imagining what needs to be created. And how we do relationship building, and then thought leadership. It's like we see the issues, so we start to articulate them in a way, and then try and change policy and inform policy making as well. Yeah.
So what's the ultimate impact? Can you give me maybe a case study or an example of a project you've run through your network, through the International Civil Society Action Network?
So there are different things. So on the policy, like global policy front, you know, we were saying from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we were saying it's really important to generate resources or channel resources to women's organizations because they're doing the work. We set up our fund. The UN then set up a fund, and governments have given money there. So we now see at least a trickle. I mean, it was a drop of resources. Now it's a bit of like a trickle of resources compared to what exists out in the world in terms of money. But there's kind of structural issues like that there is now recognition of these organizations. We had to create language. This part is really kind of, again, very jargony, but if I walk down the street and I say I do peace building, people don't know what that is. What is a woman peace builder, right? What's a peace strategist? People don't know what that is, but we've had to articulate and say to ourselves, okay, well, this is what it means to do peace building. It has a human rights element, it has mediation, but actually there's a political dimension to it. There's a connection to the community. It's not just traditional women's livelihoods. It's actually saying women want to be sitting at the tables of negotiation, determining the future. So it's so there's an element of that, and we've done that, and it's now become normalized. And so people talk about the issues that, maybe 10, 15 years ago they didn't talk about it. But on the ground, the kinds of projects that we've funded and supported for our partners, that's really where it gets extraordinary for me. So we had, back in 2015, one of the first things we funded was a colleague of ours in Nigeria who was working on the Boko Haram issues and the girls being kidnapped and so forth. And she said, look, people in my community don't know what Islam is teaching, and the Boko Haram guys come in and they say education is bad. Book is haram, book is bad. And we funded her with a small grant to do 15 weeks of community radio in local language. And they brought Islamic scholars to talk about what does Islam teach about education. People could call in and ask questions. And they did a survey, and before the radio show and after the radio show, there was a 40% increase in school enrollment in that area.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
quite an impact.
And then she went on, and her work was really recognized, and she won awards. We helped her build a peace clubs and a peace manual that blended kind of Islamic teaching with peace building principles. And she's founded a big foundation. And then back in 2019, she came to us and she said, I've discovered that there are these camps where a lot of these women and girls that are coming out of Boko Haram are sort of basically thrown in, and they've been processed by the Nigerian army, and then they're there. And there's a group of them that are isolated. And she had gone in again because she's of the community and speaks their language and so forth. And she'd managed to find out that a bunch of these women were failed suicide bombers.
Wow.
Yeah, and they had been kidnapped, they'd been brainwashed, or they had been part of the movement. And then Boko Haram had a rule that, if you're married off the first husband and he gets killed, then you're married off a second time. And then the second husband is killed, then you get sort of recruited, or you get, processed to become a suicide bomber. And some of these women wanted to actually fulfill that mission, and they been caught, and others didn't. Or were reluctant in some ways. Anyway, they had been caught in different ways by the military and shoved into this displacement camp. And my colleague found them, and my colleague's called Hamsatu Alamin. She found them and she started talking to them and slowly sort of helped them to de-radicalize, to understand that actually, killing yourself is not part of the Islamic teachings. They have children, they need to have livelihoods. She emotionally, she sort of made them feel protected. These are very young women, because they were recruited as girls. And then the more she did this, the more people showed up. So there were sort of, she's created this network. And we were supporting her work in helping these girls kind of reconnect to communities or be reintegrated, because there's a lot of mistrust as well. And this kind of work expanded and continued. And she then had a meeting with some of the top brass of the Nigerian military. And she took one or two of these women, and they told the military that when they had been picked up by the army, they'd been raped in the army camps. So imagine you've been abducted by Boko Haram, you've been brainwashed, and God knows what they've done to you, and you've created a life for yourself. Then you get picked up by the Nigerian army. They rape you, and then they dump you in a IDP camp. And in coming forward and talking to the army about it, the military basically had, on the one hand, had said to her, well, you need to do something about this. And then they realized that they needed to do something about it. And that's the last time I spoke with her about this, she said in the last 2 or 3 years, they haven't had incidences of rape reported. So something has changed. Right.
Wow.
And now she's going into prisons and talking to, and helping them process the children. That's just one example in Nigeria. I can give you examples in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Colombia. I mean, it's so inspiring talking to my partners, because we don't hear these stories in the news, and we always think that nothing is possible and it's always bad news, but it's actually not. There's some really amazing, amazing women, and they are superheroes. Yeah.
We're talking on the business of peace and hope today. How can civilians, just normal people, help promote peace and hope in politics at home?
I think the first thing is that we have to empower ourselves or feel, emboldened or the courage to ask questions. So, the national security space is probably the most Wizard of Ozzery space you can imagine. We're always told there are experts there and they're doing, the military knows what's happening and what are the threats and all this kind of stuff. But actually, if we do an exercise of going around the country and saying to people, hey, what are the security threats you feel in your community? What makes you feel insecure, right? Just imagine doing that across the whole of the United Kingdom, or any country. What you'll hear from people is going to be very different to where we put our resources, right?
Mm.
And it's not to say that there isn't a potential threat, I don't know, from the Russians or the Chinese or whoever you want to say, or it's not being naive, but it's a question of, are we really allocating our resources to deal with a pandemic, to deal with floods, because these are actual security threats to us and our communities and our countries right now, right? And the military industrial complex that right now basically monopolizes the discourse around security, national security, doesn't really want us involved in these conversations because they make a
Mm.
lot of money out of it. So, for example, a few years ago, the UK announced that they were going to have 40 new nuclear warheads prepared. It's kind of we're going to update our nuclear arsenal, and it was going to cost 150 billion pounds or something like that. Now, there's a sort of a cost that's a fixed cost, and then each of these warheads cost whatever they do. But my question was, um, you know, these warheads are only useful if they remain entirely useless, right? Because we start lobbing nukes at each other, we're all dead, right?
Mm.
So do we need 40? Do we need to spend 150 billion? What if we spent 100 billion, right? It's still a lot of money. You can still probably have enough warheads. But imagine what we could do with the other 50 billion. Imagine what it could do for the NHS and for education and for homelessness and for international development and so forth, right? So it's actually allowing ourselves into these spaces. I call it democratizing the security debate.
Mm.
And in South Africa, and just after apartheid, this is what women did. There were women in parliament, and the security, defense industry came and said, we need, however many submarines and jets and so forth. And the women in parliament said, why do we need these things? Let's go ask people what their security issues are. And it was dirty water and poverty and street lighting. And, so it's kind of again, in our field, we call it the human security lens. And the question of how human security and national security blend together is something that the public really needs to engage in, because so much of our resources, of our taxes, are going into weapons and defense industry. And the argument is often, oh, well, if we don't do it, the Chinese, if we don't sell our weapons, the Chinese will. But, there's a morality question, but there's also a question of where else these resources could go into. And finally, I mean, at the moment, if you think about what's happening with Gaza and Lebanon and what Israel is doing, what are we doing in terms of our integrity and moral standing in the world if we're enabling international laws to be broken and war crimes to be committed with our resources, and actually with our military support? So it has multiple implications for our country now and going forward. And I think that it's really important for people to feel that they're allowed to ask the questions. And once they start asking the questions, it opens so many doors and so many windows and lifts so many veils, and you realize what's actually happening out there.
It sounds like you're an absolute advocate of individual empowerment and, going out there saying to people, particularly women, you have the power to ask these questions. You have the power to promote what you want to promote and where the resources need to go. Where do you get your empowerment from?
It's an interesting question. I mean, um I think, and my organization, our acronym is ICAN, and over the years, I really sort of leaned into it in the sense of what can I do? You know, something's going on. What can I do about it? Right.
Yeah.
And I always my school reports always used to say she has potential. And I used to think, well, at some point will my potential kind of stop so that I can just, take it easy, basically. But what you realize
Relax.
is, what you realize is when you do something, then you can do more, right? So it's almost like looking at a mountain and saying, I can't climb that mountain, but you take a step, and then it's like, well, I can take another step, and I can take another step, and so forth. So there's that aspect of it, which I think is just part of how we should think about ourselves. But another thing that I've discovered as I've been doing my podcast, If You Were in Charge, which is the series that I'm doing right now, is that each week I take a different issue, different, really complicated issue, and I talk to someone who's trying to solve the problem. And what I found on whether it's biodiversity and nature conservation, police violence, progressive politics, whatever issue there is, my guests all talk about the importance of having local people involved, right? Like mobilizing from grassroots upwards and engaging people, informing people, engaging the people who care and giving them some ideas and imagination of what they can do and connecting them with others. So there is that element. There is that question of saying, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we take on issues that we care about? And the more you do, the more you realize you can do.
How important is it that we all stick together, respect each other, particularly when it comes to political conversations? Because it can be a bit controversial, can't it, having discussions? So, there's that rule of don't discuss money, politics, or religion. But these are important conversations. We need to discuss money, politics, religion. How can we do that in a respectful way, even if our political views, for example, do not always align?
So I've been thinking about this a lot. I spent 6 months in Germany recently, looking at this question of, how our societies are incredibly pluralistic and so many people, we've got everybody living together, all sorts of identities. And the political forces are taking us from the space of diversity towards differences and divisions, right? That it's like we're being sliced and diced in different ways. And what I'm interested in my own life has been, well, like, yes, there's diversity, but actually across the board, there's a lot of similarity when we start to actually peel away and not just see the surface identities. And then, so how do we weave ourselves together? And again, in this line of work that I'm doing, I find this a lot, which is that, you know, are we able to find in ourselves the humanity to speak to the other, to see the humanity in the other, right? Number one. How do we do that? Maybe it's by expanding our own notions of identity, right? So instead of saying, oh, I'm a middle-aged, Muslim-born Iranian woman who went to a private school, which kind of boxes me, right?
Mm.
Actually saying, yes, I'm all of those things. And I'm the mother of twins. And by the way, I like milk chocolate, for example, right? And
Who
maybe you
doesn't?
and I, huh?
Who doesn't?
You know,
That's a good way
who
to
doesn't?
connect.
Well,
What chocolate do you
some
like?
people are real hard, dark chocolate fans, right?
Yeah, I like it
But
all.
yeah, exactly. But it's this kind of thing of saying, can I find some point of connectivity to you where we see each other as human beings? And then from there we start talking about, well, do we think violence is a way to solving problems, right? And if you think absolutely, we have to, beat the other side to my answer is, and then what? And then
Mm.
what does tomorrow look like? What's the future we want?
When
And in
everyone's
my
dead,
work,
what do we do?
yeah, exactly. And I found that I was interviewing some gang members in Jamaica in Kingston a few years ago, and this group, it was in some backyard, sort of full of rubble, a chicken coop, and it started with three or four guys, and then as the neighborhood heard, they just kind of surrounded me. There were like 40 Jamaicans, with bullet holes and scars and all, smoking their weed and looking at me kind of like, why is this foreigner here, and the
Mm.
mistrust of the UN and so forth. But I was there with one of their sort of mates who does community work, and I was trying to understand, okay, what leads them to violence. And my starting point was, well, these are human beings as well, so what scares them? So I said, well, what makes you feel insecure, right? And so then they start talking about,
Mm.
oh, well, when we have a war with the gang next, on the other streets and so forth. And then I asked them, do you have children? Because many of them do. And I said, what do you want for your kids? So it's like this future, looking at people and saying, you must have somebody that you care about. And what do you want for that child, or your mother or your father, whoever it may be? And this one chap said, well, I want my children to have good table manners and speak well and be educated and have a good life. And at the time, my twins were 4 or 5 years old. And I was like, yeah, me too. And I was standing there going, I've just connected, and I have, I'm like, me and this gang chap have something in common, which is really strange.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm like, if this is possible, then so many other conversations are possible around thinking about what you do, taking things forward. It's not to say that you don't have red lines. Of course, we have to have red lines, right? So I can have a conversation with the Taliban, but I will have my red lines around what I think is right and just, and
Yeah.
Islamic teaching about women and so forth. But it's, if we just shun and hate and see each other as cartoon characters, one-dimensional, we're never going to get anywhere. We have to weave it together and try and see the humanity in each other.
I think that's beautiful. What a beautiful story about connectivity and the humanity, because we, as you say, we are all human. And I mean, if we can relate to each other, we can stop this cycle of hate, perhaps. I think that's quite extraordinary. What would you say to those concerned about the state of global politics, about how to keep calm during these turbulent times?
So it's a very good one. First, I think there's a level at which we have to sort of acknowledge the I feel as if we're sort of slightly rasping and gasping. It's as if a cloud has descended, and it just feels like pessimism and nothing can get done. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because otherwise we kind of lash out in different ways and either sort of hide in a corner and disconnect from the world, or become really angry. But I think just acknowledging that this is a difficult time is important. And then what I would say, and I said this to my children very often, and I try and practice it myself, is that I think it's important to see ourselves in on sort of four different pillars. Like, imagine you've got four legs of a table. So are you keeping yourself intellectually stimulated? Are you aware, taking it, whatever the issues, maybe you care about climate issues, I care about peace, but are you staying connected and feeling knowledgeable about what's happening, and continuing the conversations? Because one of the things that happens is that we get fatigued. How many images of children dying can you process, right? And you just kind of don't want to deal with it. But actually, the forces that are behind these types of violence and that sort of side of the story want us to switch off. They want us to go away and not think about this. So I think it's really important to sort of be focused and so, okay, I'm going to read my articles. I'm going to see what I engage where I can and intellectually remain connected. Secondly, I think it's really important to make sure that emotionally you're supported. Your friends, your family, you have some kind of just emotional kind of connectivity that keeps you feeling safe and loved, and it makes you feel happy. And the third element is soul food. I started writing poetry because I was like, I've tried trying to do sculpture as well, but it's like something that fills your soul and just makes you from within, makes you feel stronger. And then fourth is physical well-being. You've got to, drink your water, go for your walks, do your yoga, whatever it is, play your tennis, but just kind of balance yourself out so that you can keep the focus on the issues that you care about, and try and keep the noise out. Like, be conscious of how much of it is just nonsense gossip and how much of it is actually the real work. And that's, again, that's something that I've learned in my work, that it's really the most frustrating part is listening to the international nonsense.
Circus.
That circus is really, really debilitating. But when I start talking to my partners and I hear what they've done, that changes it, because I'm like, that's where the real stuff is. That's where the real work is going on. And if I can help them, if I can be there for them, it just gives me so much more energy to be able to fight where they need me to fight for them.
I think that's fascinating. What a brilliant conversation. Sanam Anderlini, thank you for joining me on the Business of Peace and Hope. Where can we follow you online or get in touch for more information and advice, and perhaps involved with the International Civil Society Action Network that we've been discussing today?
Thank you. So I'm still on Twitter X. My handle is SanamBNA. And I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not very good on Facebook. And then ICAN, it's icanpeacework.org. And we are also on all the social media platforms. My podcast is If You Were in Charge. It's on Spotify and iTunes and everywhere. And we are definitely at the moment discussing within ICAN, within our team and with our wider global network, whether we should do regular webinars or some kind of public engagement. So watch the space, because hopefully we'll be able to do that and people can follow the stories
I
of
think
all
you
the good
should.
work done.
Yeah,
Thank you.
fantastic. Well, good luck. Sanam Anderlini,
Thank you.
once again, thank you for joining me today. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.
How was that for you?
That was good. What did you think?
Yeah, fantastic. I'm like buzzing. It was such an
Okay.
interesting conversation. Ooh.